Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Rugby with Pads. We're trying to do something a bit different this episode. Some of you might be watching this on YouTube for the very first time. I have spent some of the off season so far playing around with OBS and a couple of other things to see whether this kind of form of content is going to be of interest to you guys. So for those of you audio listeners, you'll still get this in full clear audio. It just might sound a bit different because of the way we're recording it, because we're recording for both audiences. That said, I hope you enjoyed this format, and please let me know if you would like more content like this as well. Today is the first episode of season 2 of Rugby with Pads. So we finished the last season with our Super Bowl preview. We got most of our predictions right. The Chiefs won out, which was great. It was a really good Super Bowl, and unfortunately, I didn't get to watch all of it live, which is a shame. The perks of having a 3-week-old baby and not being able to sleep properly. But you know what, you do what you can, and I've since watched all the highlights and watched actually the full game through, all 4 hours or whatever it was of it, and yeah, it was a fantastic watch, and well done to Mahomes, who I believe could and will probably be the next Brady. He will get his 8 rings potentially that Brady may have just missed out on, unless he comes back from retirement. But what we want to do today is pivot into season 2, and I just wanted to start out by thanking you all of you who've listened to this so far. It's been really fantastic, making content for you guys, and hopefully it's been quite nice listening to it. And I wanted to share a little milestone. It's something really small, but again, for those of you watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see the screen now. But the podcast has finally hit 500 episode downloads, which is something that I don't think coming into this I thought I'd ever achieve. I thought I'd do this as a bit of a passion project. I get 3-4 listeners every time, maybe just my friends and family who I managed to get to listen to. But we've had more so, and this was a target that I set myself halfway through when we were getting a bit of traction. So we're never going to quite get it, but especially with the last few episodes having to be pre-recorded with the baby coming, and there just not being the content for fantasy out there. But thanks to you guys as a dedicated audience, we've hit it, and we've actually had a bit of an interesting audience throughout. So you'll see these are stats that I get from my podcast host. A bit of inside baseball here for those of you listening in the off season, which I don't expect to be too many of you, but hopefully we'll increase that. But as you'd expect, we've got a decent amount of people from North America and Europe listening. This is obviously a UK focused podcast, but I just want to say, thanks to any of you listening in other territories in South America, Africa, down there in Australia and New Zealand, and anyone listening to us in Asia, whether you stumbled upon us by a happy accident or have otherwise been cheerfully surprised by what we've been able to produce. Thank you so much for listening. It all counts, and we're very grateful here at Rugby with Pads Enterprises. But with that said, let's talk about what we want to talk about today. And it seems like everyone is producing content at this time, and I think it's because the next big 2 marquee events coming up in the NFL calendar that have an impact on fantasy is, of course, the Combine, which I'm recording this on the last day of February, so that will happen start in a couple of days and run for about a week, I think. So I'll try and do some content where I show some highlights from the Combine and see how it's going to impact maybe rookies when they come through. Obviously, we've had the announcement that I don't think, is it CJ Stroud or Bryce Young? One of them isn't throwing at the Combine. I think Bryce Young isn't throwing at the Combine, but that opens up to the guys like Richardson and Levis to really show that they are Combine stars, and hopefully we'll see their stock rise throughout the year. And anything that can make the mix up a little bit funny, so I can get hold of Bijan Robinson, who I think is the 101. But a lot of drafts, sometimes you can't just draft the best player available. Sometimes you've got to draft the player that you need. But we will be looking at the other side of the side of football, which is the veterans, what happens to them. And there's a lot going on around free agents. So free agency starts on the 15th of March, so in a couple of weeks' time. And there is a lot of content out there at the moment. I've just been starting to read the top 101 free agents from our friends over at the NFL, around the NFL. Greg Rosenthal, who definitely doesn't know who I am, but I've been a big fan of him for a number of years as well. But there's a lot out there. Obviously there's going to be the marquee ones, and maybe we're spoiling the surprise a little bit here with Lamar Jackson ranked as number 1. I think he's going to be number 1 in most people's minds. but we've got some really interesting players coming into free agency who I think are really going to have a huge impact. We've got Orlando Brown, Daniel Jones, Derek Carr has obviously just come on free agency. I haven't really included him in my thoughts because he was released, but what I really want to do is start to focus on players who have potential to either stick or twist effectively. And how they're going to have an impact on fantasy. So we've got people like Carson Wentz, who's just been released today, I think, or last night. So I'm not really going to focus on him. Plus, I don't really think he has a huge amount of fantasy relevance anymore. It's not 20. Well, when did they win? 2016, 2017? Yeah, it's not then anymore anyway. Derek Carr, I think, is going to be an interesting mix in the QB carousel. I talked about that on the last episode. We've got Jalen Ramsey courting free agency as well. Or not free agency, he's looking for a trade actually. So that might be another episode we do as well. And of course, we've got our good friend Robert Woods, Bobby Trees entering into free agency now. He's been released as well. So there's a good number of people who on here that I might not have considered because they've more recently changed. But I just wanted to share with you guys my top free agencies from a fantasy perspective. I wrote this a couple of weeks back, just when I was playing around with some content before. And if you're watching here, I've got a very makeshift slideshow to show you, which feels completely amateurish, but you know what, hopefully you guys enjoy this type of content, and I'll be able to improve on it. I'm basically using March through August before draft season properly happens, to refine my content delivery, and to see what we can what's going to resonate with you guys. So hopefully this kind of stuff does. So I originally started this as top 20, but then I looked at who was fantasy relevant, and it turned out to be more. And it's not going to surprise you, but the top. Let's just start with it, shall we? The top free agent out there, I think, it's got to be Lamar Jackson, hasn't it? Whether or not he hits free agency or not, I think my first thoughts were, how can an organization like the Ravens, who are built for the run and built around Lamar Jackson, how could they pass on keeping him around? I just feel like they wouldn't be able to. It'd be suicide for them as an organization. But as it drags on, it feels like more and more likely to be able to go that way. I'll skip through these a little bit, but then we've got in the 2 and 3, I think, the fantasy free agents. We've got Saquon and Josh Jacobs. I think they're really interesting. Saquon, he's going to demand a big contract, but he is getting on in age. I'm not sure how old is he these days. Is he in his late 20s? Let's have a quick look on the other screen here. But he had a fantastic season. He's 26. Okay, he's not getting that one in age. I feel like when I say these guys are getting on in age, I have no room to talk being a 34-year-old dad of 2. But he is fantastic. He's originally from New York. Does he want to stay there? Potentially. Will they want him to stay there? Definitely. Does he have to? No, he doesn't. And same with Josh Jacobs. I think he could be a really interesting prospect because they didn't have faith in him to extend him to his 5th year. He was, after all, we forget, he was a first round pick. They didn't extend him to a 5th year option. Let's see what happens there. And he had such a great, fantastic, whatever last season was, his 4th season. So he really put himself out there. I have put Brady in here because I just worry that he's going to come back and haunt us all. Whether he does or not, I don't know. But we'll highlight him in yellow or red actually, because we're not sure if he's going to be back. But his likely trajectory is free agency into some kind of ownership. He'll be on ESPN or Fox or wherever he's signed with. But you have to mention him because for me, it's once bitten, twice shy. I dropped him from a dynasty roster when he retired the first time, and then he didn't retire. We've got Tony Pollard here. I think he's going to be an impact player. Whether he can prove, the reason I've got him a bit lower than Saquon and Josh Jacobs is whether he can be proved to be a true number 1. That's to be decided. Juju is obviously going to float around. I think he's probably one of the hot wide receiver prospects after winning a Super Bowl. Does he want to go after another ring? Does he want to go do something else? Don't know. And Miles Sanders as well, as being in the Super Bowl, he played fantastically well. He was annoying for fantasy, but it is what it is. And then you've got some of the rest of the guys who are really important as well. Geno Smith had a great season last year. Mike Gesicki fell off a little bit, but he is still a top tight end prospect for anyone wanting a true pass catcher. Dalton Schultz, I think, showed out when he was available. Alan Lazard in a thin wide receiver market, I think shows out to be a top candidate because of his physical attributes and the fact he is such a fantastic impact blocker. You've also got OBJ floating around there, and of course, you can't mention. I feel like he should be higher because he's such a record breaker. Jamal Williams for the Detroit Lions. Although I think everyone thinks he's gonna stay there. And doing a rundown of the rest of my top 26/25 because Brady's really out of there. We've got Kareem Hunt. Again, he has proven himself in the past to be an RB1. Can he reclaim that? Let's see. We've got Raheem Mostert, who I think really showed out well, and I think we all wish the best for him because he's such a fantastic and dynamic player when he's actually on the pitch. Evan Engram, I think, had a career renaissance down in Jacksonville. Robert Tunyon, probably the opposite, but he's still got a lot of attributes there that I think a lot of teams will find are really appealing. We've got Danny Dimes, or Danny Derp, as he's sometimes called. I think he's more Danny Dimes these days. I think he is definitely. Daniel Jones has turned a corner as a quarterback prospect at just the right time in a contract year. So let's see how he goes with that. And again, they didn't take up his 5th-year option as well. So whether he's he's going to be out there in the midst. Jimmy G is going to be leaving the 49ers unless he doesn't, because whatever whatever Kyle Shanahan says, you got to take it with a pinch of salt. McCole Hardman was fantastic down the stretch as a player for KC. Whether he is a KC only kind of player, we'll see what happens there. Jarrett McKinnon, again, he was a Super Bowl starlet as well, and very much key in the playoff run for both your fantasy and in real life for the Kansas City Chiefs. DJ Chark, I think, has showed that he has the attributes there. Whether he'll want to stay somewhere that gave him another chance, I think that'd be interesting. Mike White, we're getting into the dregs here. Mike White was an interesting prospect down the stretch as well for a few games. I think the Jets are going to go somewhere else, but we'll see what happens to him. And Austin Hooper, Irv Smith, tight ends is a difficult place to look at. Irv Smith been so injured that whether he gets given another chance, we'll see. And finally, Jacoby Myers, and I might, after all of this is considered, might raise Jacoby Myers to being a bit more interesting, because I think he is a bit more interesting than maybe I give him credit for. So we'll see how that goes. Now, what I wanted to do today is go through this and look at where I think people could land and should land. So there's two sides to that. There's where people should land and where people will land. And I think let's look at both of them in tandem, because there's a fantasy side of things that we want to project and we say, oh, he would be a great fix for X and what have you, or he would be a great fit for Y. And then there is the other side of it where we're confident they're not going to go anywhere and they're going to stay with, because the maths doesn't work out, whether it's cap, whether it's something else. So we're going to go by position with these rankings. So that's your rankings 1 through 25, 26. And I've done, if you're on the screen as well, you've got positional rankings, but I'll go through them in their positional rankings, position by position. And eventually we'll have two competing teams: a stay at home team, the safe option, the reality, the most likely option based on my opinions and my analyst eyes. And then we've got our fantasy team, the one who I think is going to ball out, and we'll try and pit them up against each other and see who would win out. So starting with quarterbacks, obviously top of the list we've got Lamar Jackson. He is just insane. He's the reality and the sensible option for me is that he stays with the Ravens for all things considered. But I wrote this a couple of weeks back, and I don't think that's likely going to be the option, because as this goes on, I think it's more and more likely that he is going to drop off and he's going to be franchise tagged, and maybe there's a franchise tag that allows you to have first refusal or something like that, but to drive at the price. And I think that's the way Lamar wants to go. He wants to test free agency. He wants to become Kirk Cousins rich, because look back at the moves that Kirk Cousins has made. He has made a lot of money in that regard. But I think someone who would fit, because I think, is Lamar a Georgia native? I think he is, but I think Atlanta would be great. And I think because they've got weapons around him, they've got Drake London, they've got Kyle Pitts, and he could prove himself to be a passing threat. They have great, it fits as well because they've got great draft capital. I think they're building players around there. I think even some of the bit part players would be great, and they've got a low key, a decent defense as well that just didn't play well enough last year. Arthur Smith likes a mobile quarterback. He's done well in the past with that. And it does make sense, just to have the weapons around him. I think they will tool up to go and take on an NFC South, which is in dire need. Obviously, if he stays at the Ravens, why he stays at Ravens, there's MVP potential. It'd be insane not to, but I think insanity rules out here. We're going to skip over Brady here because, yes, he's retired. He might come back. If he does, he'll go to Vegas or Miami. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. But he's just going for the memes at this point. I feel like, but let's move on to someone who is in free agency, and it is a top free agent. According to Greg Rosenthal, he is the number 2 available free agent, and I probably wouldn't doubt that based on his history. Maybe I know Greg is a big fan of Geno Smith, and if you listen to the Around the NFL podcast, there is a lot of in jokes and segments about Geno Smith, but he will stay in Seahawks, and I've projected him in the fantasy to stay in Seahawks because the reliability of service to the wide receivers, they need that consistency. They got out of the shadow of Russ, and he's proven himself, and Geno's proven himself to be a bit of a Pete Carroll pet. So I think he'll stay, and I hope for fantasy reasons. So on left hand side, we see there the fantasy considerations. The reason I've put him there is what I want from fantasy and why I think he should go there, because he needs to be able to service DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett and Will Dissly even as well. Noah Fant, he's got that reliability and that requirement to service those, and the run game. It gets helped with him as well. Ken Walker had, in some people's eyes, a rookie of the year season last year. He didn't win it, but from fantasy perspective, he was really fantastic, and maybe he should have won some more plaudits for that. Danny Dimes, he will stay at New York, I think, because the Brian Daboll effect. He's going to try and be the next Josh Allen, potentially. But from fantasy perspective, I'd like to see him go to Indianapolis because he's going to have this QB whisperer type coach. I can't remember the name of the guy, but apparently he is the guy he's the next QB whisperer. I think Matt Nagy was once a QB whisperer, and that didn't work out. But regardless, I think it could be interesting in Indianapolis. And if they don't try and trade up and they go for Danny Dimes instead, it could be really interesting because they've got a lot of draft capital. They could move back in the draft a little bit, draft a couple of decent wide receivers, a potential new number 1 or a 1A to sit beside Michael Pittman. And there's enough free agency out there to fill in the gaps. I don't think they're as far away as an organization as you think. Yeah, there's questions on the defense a little bit, but it could be interesting. And I think if they deploy the Danny Dimes offense with Jonathan Taylor as that running combination that they had with Saquon Barkley, I think it could be really interesting for Danny Dimes and really increase his stock. So I like that move if it ever can do. Jimmy G, I think it's obvious where he's going. I think he's going to Houston as a bridge quarterback. They will draft someone new, but you know what? New people get injured too, so let's see what happens there. But the 49ers coaching tree is there, and they're probably one of the only teams who can afford to pay him because he's after a lot of money, as is Derek Carr as well, who haven't got this on this list, but we'll see where he goes at a later date. And finally, we've got Mike White, who is in my considerations. I would love him to go to Vegas because the memes as well. I think he is a better quarterback than you think, but it also improves Devontae Adams' stock because he's not afraid to sling it, and it doesn't give Mike White any better propositions. But I think Devontae Adams would relish someone to train and to work with. But I think he's likely to back up a big name like Aaron Rodgers or Derek Carr. We'll see which way the Jets go on that consideration. I for one hope that Aaron Rodgers goes to the Jets because that would fly in the face of a trade I did last season and actually give me a good chance to make good on it. So we'll see. Running backs, there's a lot more going on here. I've already talked about Saquon being the number 1 prospect, and I've already thought he will stay in the kind of New York media market because he's a New York native as well. I didn't realize he's actually from the Bronx as well. So why stay at the New York Giants? Because I don't think they can afford to lose him. But Buffalo, Buffalo's interesting. They have a bit of cap space that they need to shift around a little bit. They've got some, some things to do there. It's an upgrade on all the pretenders they've had at running back, and maybe it's the thing that unlocks them to go to the Super Bowl. Their Super Bowl window is tightening as Josh Allen, it requires more contracts. They have a decent wide receiver room. They maybe need a wide receiver too. They've got a decent defense as well. It's maybe aging out in a couple of points, but they really need to hit it this year, and they need to go and win the AFC Championship and ultimately the Super Bowl. And I think Saquon could unlock that for them. And I think it could unlock Saquon even more so to have just more reliability, and the fact that they will be ahead in more games than they're not, which is not true of New York. But yeah, it'd be interesting. But whether Saquon gives them a hometown discount, left to be decided. Although New York Giants play in Jersey, basically. So is it hometown? I don't know. Either way, I think he's staying in the market. I'd love to see him in Buffalo, if only to see another super team compete against Kansas City. Although Kansas City really aren't a super team. You really look at that roster, it's crazy. I think Josh Jacobs will stay with the Raiders. I think because they realise what they've got, and I think they're going to pay him. I think they're going to pay him, which is contrary to what you see in a lot of running back contracts, because you can replace people, but I think they're going to pay him. But I would love to see him in Miami, because you can consolidate the three backs that you have into one person who can do it all and save on a load of cap and just have that superstar you can rely on. He's relatively resilient, and I think he'd be really interesting and a definite upgrade between Mostert, whoever they've got. They've all the other 49ers running backs that they've had back in the day. Tony Pollard, I think he will end up staying with the Cowboys. He's got a lower cap hit than Zeke. The optics is all better there. NFC opponents will nab him up if he's available, because running back who hasn't got as many miles on him is great. But I think someone who will actually want to pop him up is Carolina. That they've got a couple of running backs who are aging out a little bit, which isn't great. Some people who played really well, but I don't think it's a good look for Carolina at the moment. And as they retool, I think they need someone to bring in fresh as they bring in a new quarterback, which hopefully will be Anthony Richardson, maybe Will Levis, depending on if he slides that way or if they trade up. But I think that could be a good coup for him, and finally give him the number one spot undisputed that he so desperately deserves. Miles Sanders is an interesting one, because he hates fantasy football, but we're talking about him anyway. I think he's going to run it back, and he's going to cost them, but they're building around a young QB who isn't costing them a huge amount. I think they're going to pay him early, but we'll see how that works. But I would be interested to see him on the Broncos, because I think the Broncos aren't too far away from actually being okay. Russ needs to get his head out of his bum, and stop being so corny, but they suffered from injury a lot last year, especially the running back position. Everyone loves Javonte Williams and everyone loves the prospect of him, but Sanders is just more reliable, and I think he protects a lot, and he becomes the number one by de facto, and maybe he becomes a bit more fancy relevant there as well. I don't think there's any doubt that Jamal Williams, Jay Willie, stays where he is. He's found his home in Detroit. Let's say no more about that. He is staying where he is. But I do think it's interesting to see Kareem Hunt, where he could go. I think if there's plenty of teams. I think he'll leave regardless. So I think the reality of it, they might stack him up into that 1-2-3 combo that they've got in Philly if they lose out on Miles Sanders or Boston Scott or Kenny Gainwell. I think Kenny Gainwell's still available, but I think Boston Scott might be up for free agency as well. But I'd love to see him on the Rams, because he will be relatively cheap, because he's still got a couple of legal issues around him. He's a 3-down back, and I think he could be incredibly complimentary and maybe recapture that number one spot that he needs, because I don't trust Cam Akers as well, despite being a Rams fan. You'll see from behind me. I don't trust Cam Akers, and I don't think I ever will. Not after he had his little hissy fit last year. Raheem Mostert, I think he'll stay in Miami, because he's earned himself a starting spot finally. But he could retool and follow that 49ers coaching tree over to Houston. That'd be interesting for me. I think he could again turn out to be a number one back as well. And finally, Jerick McKinnon. There's a lack of trust everywhere in KC with rookies and CEH. I mean, everyone thought Isaiah Pacheco was going to be the bell cow, and he is, but he's not given third down work. Does Jerick McKinnon just want to be that? I don't know. if he does, maybe there's a better place to do it, and maybe have an easier run to a division title as well in Tampa Bay. He could be complementary to Rashard White if they move away from Lenny. It's a minor thing. I don't think he's going to come into the consideration when we think about our super teams. Right, tight ends. Let's have a look through those. There's a few guys here. I'll skip through these because there's not many I'm really passionate about talking here. If you're watching on screen, you'll see what I'm talking about here. But Mike Gesicki, I think he will leave the Miami. I don't think there's any room for him in a Kyle Shanahan-esque offense there under Mike McDaniel. Not Mike. Is it Mike McDaniel? Yes, it is. Correct me in the comments if I've got that wrong here. Blame baby brain. But I think he may well go to Detroit because there's no names at the position. Not that they need names. I think they did very well, even though they moved on from Hawkinson. But they do like that physical ball catcher, and they do have a lack of pass catchers over in Detroit. So I think it could be interesting. But if he goes to Green Bay for fantasy purposes, he could be a 1A receiver. He could be better than their wide receiver. So I think that's a really good shout. And for the same reason, I would like to see Dalton Schultz over in Tennessee. Have I spelled Tennessee wrong? Apparently I have. Yes, I did. I didn't have enough ends, but it ruins my formatting. But that's for another time anyway. Great content for you audio listeners here. But again, he could be a number one receiver in Tennessee. Not a great offense, but beggars can't be choosers. But I think he'll stay at the Cowboys because he's got their type, and Jerry will find a way to make it work. Evan Ingram, I think, is a really interesting case because he's had that career renaissance though, and I think he'll end up staying with the Jags. I really do because they look like true AFC contenders, and they gave faith in him. I think they'll reward that. I think Ingram will reward that by not asking for too much money. He'll look for a team friendly contract. They're building around obviously a cheaper quarterback in Trevor Lawrence. Yeah, I think it could be interesting. But likewise, the Bengals, their Super Bowl window is always open, and they don't really have a true number one over in the tight end position, which Evan Engram could be, and with the potential of losing maybe T Higgins, maybe more, they could load up again, and potential of a loss of pass catchers really gives me thought that it would be interesting to see him on the Bengals, and I think he could add up a lot, and he could upgrade himself massively, especially on quarterback. Finally, we've got we'll look at the dregs a little bit. We've got Robert Tonyan. I reckon he'll stay at Green Bay because the talent pool is small, but it'd be nice to see him in Miami. He's a great great blocking tight end. Then we've got Austin Hooper. He'll probably go to the Browns, or is he on the Browns already? I can't remember where he is, but either way, it's not too important. He'll probably be at the Browns. I'd like to see him in Carolina because he can support a new QB. He's got a lot of intelligence about him. He's a very clever guy, and he's a very interesting tight end. He plays the game well. I think he's got a lot of experience to show on a potential new quarterback where you need a safety valve. And finally, Irv Smith. I think he'll go to San Francisco. I really do. I hope he does because I think it'd be interesting to see him take over from a potentially injured great in not Kyle Pitts. He's a future great potentially. I can't remember. George Kittle. That's who I'm talking about. Again, the brain's gone. I need to do more research here, but I think that he will end up staying in Minnesota because I don't think they've seen him enough for a full season. And finally, we go to wide receivers. Again, I think this was pretty talent poor when it came to it, but I might juggle it about a little bit. Juju, I think, will stay at KC. They'll run it back. They want another ring. He will probably give him a discount as well because he's obviously not too concerned about the money because I think he went to KC for a bare minimum contract. But it would be really interesting, I think, for fantasy purposes in New York at the Giants because they really need a true number one. And I think he could be that. He could be their slot guy. He could be the guy, he is the pseudo check down, but he's got a bit about him as well. And I realise this is listed with spelling errors. It shows my dyslexia coming through here. So again, great audio content for you guys. Listen, have a watch on YouTube, see what you think. Alan Lazard, again, I think he'll stay in Green Bay because just like so many players, unless they draft someone, which they don't draft wide receivers in the first round, they can't afford to lose the talent. But I think he would be great in Tennessee just because, I guess, he's yeah, I think he's a good blocker. He will be great in the run game, but I don't think that's particularly fancy relevant. So I don't really like that choice here. OBJ threatened to come back last year as a Cowboy or I think he flirted with everyone, but I think he will probably come back as a Cowboy just for the branding alone, and slip in as a 1B/2 to CD Lamb, who I think has asserted himself as a number one in the press and everyone's mind as well. But wouldn't it be great for fancy purposes to see him along such toxic personalities as Aaron Rodgers? Oh, that'd be tasty. I don't think Aaron Rodgers will be in Green Bay, but yeah, that will be a recipe for disaster and some great content on the Pat McAfee show. Um, Apologies, that was my phone going off in the background there. We've also got Nicole Hardman. Again, I can't spell for toffee, can I? Nicole, not McCold. Maybe that's autocorrect. I don't know, but I think he'll stay in KC. Again, he's one of those players. He's a role player that I think they just seem to like him. But he would be great in Houston because the replacement of Brandon Cooks, who I think is destined to leave via trade somehow. And then you've got DJ Chark. I think the Bears would do a lot to try and capture him. I think he'll return, but I think if not, the Bears who are cap rich and needy of someone to play alongside a pretty poor receiver core to give Justin Fields what he needs. I think DJ Chark works out really well there. But from fancy purposes, again, I think he would be great in the Cowboys because I think he complements CD Lamb's abilities so very well. And Jacoby Myers, I had down here at in low grade. I think he'll probably end up going to Vegas because of that connection with the Patriots and Josh McDaniels. But wouldn't it be great if he went and became that possession guy for the Los Angeles Chargers? And I really think he would. I think the first time I mentioned the Chargers in this so far, but I think he could be a really interesting replacement for Keenan Allen on those possession routes as well. Yeah, really confident Mike Williams. Both Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, not pretty long in the tooth, whereas when it comes to fantasy and comes to the NFL. But yeah, I think both of those could be interesting. But let's look finally of let's compare and contrast these two teams, and what we're going to do is a slow reveal of where we think the best guys are. And this seems much more exciting in my head, but hopefully this makes for good content for you guys. Over at QB, in our reality team, we of course have Lamar Jackson at the Baltimore Ravens. He is they would be stupid to let him go, but he may well do. And if he does, I think we need to compare him to, let's have a look here. It's Lamar Jackson on the Atlanta Falcons. Now, personally, I don't know who wins out here, but I think it's really interesting to see Lamar Jackson on the Atlanta Falcons here. We're doing a bit of a mix. We're only going to focus on offensive players, obviously. We've got 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and 2 flex. So we'll go in order of importance. And the running back positions for the reality team, the ones that we expect to happen. Drum roll, please. We've got Saquon Barkley and Josh Jacobs. They're my 1 and 2. They'll stay if they stay where they are. They will be fantastic, and they will be great for fantasy as well. And in our fantasy realms, let's see who we've got. Oh wait, we've got the same guys again, but we've got an upgrade, I think, on both terms. We've got Saquon Barkley over in Buffalo, Josh Jacobs over in Miami. I think that they could both be really interesting. As our wide receiver 1 in our reality draft, we've got Juju Smith-Schuster. Again, it was a pretty poor group, but I think he'll stay in Kansas City, and I think he'll do fantastically well. And going up against him in the fantasy draft, again, we have Juju Smith-Schuster, but I think he will be a bit more of an upgrade over in New York, depending on whether they keep Danny Dimes or not. And finishing off the wide receiver roster here, we've got Jacoby Myers over in New England and Alan Lazard in Green Bay. Yeah, more than likely they're all going to stay. And do they attract people? They're definitely good free agents, and I'm probably underselling Jacoby Myers quite considerably. And over on the other side, in our fantasy draft, I think just for the pure memes and toxicity of Odell Beckham Jr., if he goes to Green Bay, I think he'd be fancy wildfire. I think everyone would want to draft him way too high. And then we've got DJ Chark over in Dallas as well. I think he could be a real asset to them and a real asset to your fantasy team. At tight end, which is, if you've been listening to this, it's possibly the worst position that I ever draft in fantasy. I don't value it enough, and maybe I should, because Travis Kelce won me a league last year. So Dalton Schultz, I think that at Dallas is a really interesting prospect. But in terms of fantasy impact, in the fantasy realm, I would love to see Evan Ingram on the Cincinnati Bengals. I think he could be great. And finally, we'll finish up with our flex positions. I've got Miles Sanders. In the reality, I've got Miles Sanders in Philadelphia, Jamal Williams in Detroit, versus in our fancy draft, Tony Pollard and Carolina, and I'm gonna put some hometown in here, Kareem Hunt at the LA Rams. So let's run through that finally, just for everyone listening on audio. In the most likely, what's going to happen, we've got Lamar Jackson staying with Baltimore, Saquon staying with the Giants, Josh Jacobs staying in Vegas, Juju Smith at Kansas City, Jacoby Myers staying with the Patriots, Alan Lazard staying with the Packers, Dalton Schultz staying in Dallas, Miles Sanders staying in Philly, and Jamal Williams, who's finally found his home in Detroit. In our fancy draft, in the ones that we really think could really impact, we've got Lamar Jackson over in Atlanta, Saquon Barkley in Buffalo, Josh Jacobs in Miami, Juju Smith-Schuster in New York, Odell Beckham Jr. in Green Bay, just toxic, beautiful, and DJ Chark in Dallas. At tight end, we've got Evan Ingram at the Bengals, and I think a massive upgrade for Tony Pollard in Carolina, and just some hometown love for Kareem Hunt at the LA Rams. Now, who wins out? Now, I think personally the fancy draft wins out at QB. I think Lamar Jackson at Atlanta is better than Lamar Jackson at Baltimore based on the last couple of seasons, if only to avoid injury. I think that's a really big thing. And just to refresh it a little bit, I think Saquon Barkley in Buffalo is better. But I do think Josh Jacobs would serve himself better staying in. Where is he staying? Staying in Las Vegas as well. I've got Juju staying in Dallas as probably being slightly better, so it evens it up at 2-2 there. But I would, if we compare the wide receivers at this point, Odell Beckham versus Jacoby Myers, I probably prefer. I don't really know. I probably prefer Jacoby Myers just for now because he's a known concept. So maybe it's 3-2 to reality. I do prefer DJ Chark over in Dallas, so they tighten up at 3-3. I prefer Evan Ingram over in Cincinnati. I think he's got just more about him. I prefer Tony Pollard over in Carolina, and of course I prefer Jamal Williams over in Detroit. So I think the fancy draft wins out just. Yeah, I think it's a 5-4 to the fancy team. So let's give it up for that. But let me know in the comments what you think and what you would have done differently. And that's all your content for today. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time, hopefully, to look at the what happened in the combine, and we are planning on doing a bit of a dynasty overhaul and looking at doing a bit of a dynasty deep dive with a couple of my friends who are in dynasty leagues with me as well. Because at the moment in off season, there's nothing really to be excited about for redraft. It's best ball and dynasty. So let's dive in on that trend. But thank you once again for listening. As always, you can find me on all the socials at Rugby with Pads. You can email us at sam@rugbywithpads.com or info@rugbywithpads.com. Yeah, we're getting a bit more professional. And what's his space? If you aren't following us already on all the socials, please do so because we'll be dropping some merch, of which I was going to wear today, but it's in the wash, unfortunately. I've been testing it out. And we were doing a merch drop as well as a website drop soon. But as always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you on the virtual gridiron.